Times of crisis are always great times for fake news and propaganda.
Now to the growing number of hoaxes that are popping up online.
Fact-checking has the potential to be...
The communication of this information is part of our response to a global health crisis.
Welcome to Disinformation in Times of Crisis, a podcast on how media professionals can prevent the spread of disinformation. I'm Anastasia, former broadcast journalist from Uzbekistan.
I'm Louise, a freelance journalist from Denmark. Today is the final episode of our three-part series where we reflect on what it's like to start working in the media industry during the COVID-19 pandemic and what lessons media professionals can learn from the current situation. In this episode, we'll focus on the legacy of this crisis and what it will mean for journalism after the pandemic.
Governments across the globe have taken extraordinary power to tackle the global pandemic through emergency laws and other measures. For example, in Hungary, Serbia, and Turkey, there are penalties for spreading false news. And even in liberal democracies like Austria, Germany, and Italy, the governments have taken unprecedented measures to monitor citizens, such as tracking their movement through cell phone data. A number of politicians in different countries have passed emergency laws to prevent the spread of the virus. The question is, will they ever stop these restrictions? In this episode, we'll talk about the burdens that the global health crisis has brought to the world political system and how journalists best tackle them. The world demands responsible leadership, but responsible journalism is no less important. How can we save our profession and shape a better future for journalism in these circumstances? Louise, what do you think?
I guess after this pandemic, journalism won't look the same. We've seen many political leaders distancing themselves from cooperation with other countries. Authoritarianism is on the rise because COVID-19 has given autocratic leaders an opportunity to grab power. There have been examples of repression in China, Turkey, and even Hungary, which is quite close to where we are here in the Netherlands. There have been news on several Indian states as well, for example, where police have arrested people without charge. And at the same time, we're talking about protests against police brutality all around the world, which I believe have been successful in some way.
Yes. We see that the pandemic has put a lot of pressure on journalism across the world. Even well-established media conglomerates face these challenges. We talked to former BBC investigative journalist John Sweeney and asked him how journalists should work in these circumstances. John Sweeney is an old-school journalist who cut his teeth on some major investigations, overturning the false convictions of 3 women for murdering their babies, and did plenty of work in Russia, including the shutting down of MH17, the Malaysian Airlines flight in eastern Ukraine. We want to apologize for the quality of the sound in advance, as RNTC conducted these interviews amidst the global pandemic. Thankfully, new technologies allow us to connect people from different corners of the world, but we still can't always ensure a good sound. We asked John how difficult he thinks it is for journalists to operate in the current environment.
It's extremely difficult. Number one, because the entire business is under massive threat because of the collapse in advertising. Number two, if you take lockdown seriously, and as we're kind of semi-public figures, you have to, it's extremely difficult to have confidential conversations with people which aren't being hacked in by the Chinese, the Russians, or whoever's listening into this right now. That's a major problem. So that there's a source I was very, very keen to have a drink with, who finally said, okay, let's have a drink, and then the lockdowns happened. And that's a story which is on hold. Thirdly, the bosses are risk averse. They don't want to run stories which might cause trouble with the government, or because at the moment the government, certainly the government in Britain, is financially almost the only game in town, and you need to be accurate, and you kind of need to be inside the major organizations. So it's extremely difficult, and frankly, I'm tearing my hair out.
As we've talked in the first episode of this series, journalists around the globe, especially in authoritarian countries or transitional democracies, are heavily dependent on government sources. When the corona crisis unfolded, this became even more of an obvious trend. For example, Uzbekistan's journalists say that while reporting on the global pandemic, they solely rely on official government sources, whom they see as an ultimate authority providing credible information. This reflects how powerful governments become in times of crisis because they possess exclusive and crucial information that people need and want to know.
Yes. The thing is that journalists are supposed to report on what government officials say to hold them to account, but in these times that can actually be problematic.
What do you mean by that, Louise?
Well, in the US, for instance, there was a big debate about whether journalists should live stream the press briefings from the White House or not. Now, normally this is considered a basic and essential journalistic practice, but because Trump was spreading so much false information during those press briefings, some media critics suggested that live streaming these press briefings would actually do more harm than good to journalists and also to the public. When these press briefings are live streamed, journalists must really contextualize and correct all the false information after the live stream to make sure that it doesn't harm the public or the reputation of their profession. So journalists even need to think critically about their own role and also about their practices.
Then another question arises. As the governments gain more power in times of crisis, journalists need to report more critically on them. But what is the best way to do that? We've asked John Sweeney how young journalists should cover the COVID-19 pandemic. Shall we listen?
Yes, let's do that.
It's bewilderingly difficult. It's bewilderingly difficult because there are the science is disputed on COVID, but essentially the picture is becoming clearer. It's foggy, but the fog is dying down. Those governments that put in a lockdown early and test and traced early have been much more successful in keeping down the death numbers. And the two big governments that were late to lockdown and have been slow or weak in enforcing it, the United States and Britain, have got the worst number of deaths in the world. So that's the evidence. It's been very difficult because the Chinese Communist Party, who have too much power in China and in the world generally with their use of their influence, were not straight about the death numbers in China to begin with, and that's caused confusion and misunderstanding. But anyway, the science has become clearer. Then you've got the interplay with government, which at the moment is way more important than it's normally been. In an open society, you've got business, ordinary people doing their thing, and the government tries to organize it. But essentially, in this time of crisis, the government is the only one, because it's got taxpayers' money behind it, that can look it's become more and more powerful, which means that journalistic scrutiny is more and more important. And at the same time, one has to be right if you're looking at, if you're being critical of government. And by the way, that's the only job, worthwhile job in journalism, is being critical of people in power. But you've got to get your evidence right. So you've got to check. You've got to check and check and check. Who's saying this? If they're being critical of the government, if there's a dodgy program, something that's corrupt, something that looks corrupt, the government has bought dodgy Chinese ventilators, you want to know for sure that the detail's right.
The reliance on governments requires journalists to be more aware of what they are writing about. And even if John Sweeney is tearing his hair out, journalism newbies like us, Louise, should panic, no?
We shouldn't lose hope, for sure. As John said, our job is particularly important in these times, so I think it's a matter of finding ways to be resilient, as we have also discussed in the previous podcast. The pandemic really gives us some food for thought. It allows us to reconsider what we do as journalists. We talked about the spread of disinformation, fake news, and pressures on the media, and the lack of trust, and so on. All these challenges invite us to think about ways to change, really.
Yes, obviously, and verifying information carefully is a crucial point that all journalists should take with themselves when stepping down to the new order once the pandemic has begun to fade. But another crucial question is, what is our role as public servants? Do we educate or encourage our audience, or do we navigate it? And how should we deal with the current political and economic issues that risk being amplified after the crisis?
Yeah, I mean, those are all really great, really important questions. They're definitely not easy to answer, especially when we consider that the public's trust in the media has been declining for years already. We have some insights from Craig Silverman, who is known as an expert in fake news and verification. And he talks about how to build trust with the audience, especially under these difficult circumstances.
Trust in government, trust in business, trust in a lot of our public institutions have also been declining. And so there's a broader trend, but I do think that we in the media as journalists need to really think about this and think about how we can start to build that back up. And I do think one piece of it is really focusing on, who do we serve and how do we know whether we're giving them what they need or not? So listening to people, that's the first step of it, I think. Who are we serving? And what do they tell us they want? What do they say are the problems? What are the challenges? What are the things that make them not trust us? And some of the data that's come from those surveys and that kind of work is that our process of producing journalism, of producing news, is still very opaque and not very well understood by the audience. They often don't understand, what the process for deciding, how to include an anonymous source or not is. Sometimes people think that's literally a source the journalist doesn't know. Right? And so the process needs to be demystified and opened up. And we need to find ways to bring the community into it.
So, as we've just heard, journalists should listen to their audience in the spike of this chaotic information. Tools are very helpful, as we've also discussed in our first episode. But our brain, our own logical thinking, is our primary tool as journalists. The most important is to make the content relevant to our audience, and their opinion should be voiced. Wow, that was a lot to take on, Anastasia. What do you think?
Yes, indeed, that's a lot. And amidst the global pandemic, not only trust in journalism is declining, but also trust in public institutions. For example, according to the poll conducted by YouGov in late May 2020, less than half of British people trust their government to provide correct information on the pandemic. By contrast, 6 weeks earlier, 2/3 of Britons trusted their government as a source of information about COVID. Trust in news organizations is also down from 57% to 46%. But as Craig mentioned, journalists' focus should be on listening to people rather than rebuilding their trust in governments. The great news is that there are a lot of resources that journalists can use to improve their coverage of the pandemic. Louise, I know you and Amin covered some of them in our previous episode. So, what were your favorite lessons from our experts?
Well, I think most of them have emphasized that we need to think critically about the information that we have. And then, of course, as we just heard, we need to find out how we can best serve the public. And that includes thinking about what information the public needs the most and how we can best present that information. So we really have to think about the effects that our coverage is going to have on the public. And as a third lesson, I'd say, of course, start getting creative with your fact-checking tools.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And for me, these are also the basics: verifying information, building trust with your audience by asking more questions, providing best possible solutions. And I'd say not losing hope, because even if we are facing challenging social, political, and economic situations, hope and resilience can help journalists to find resources to continue hold those in power accountable and serve the public.
Yes, indeed. I think you're absolutely right. It's about continuing the fight, really. So we hope for the best future for our profession and contribute to making journalism better.
Yes, let's do that, Louise. You are listening to the final episode of Disinformation in Times of Crisis podcast. I'm Anastasia.
And I'm Louise.
Thank you for listening to us. Goodbye.
Bye.